Welcome, everybody. My name is Shelley Klein. I'm currently president of Generations After, and I'm so pleased that you all could join us. People are still slowly making their way in, but I think we should probably begin. Just to let you know, in case you didn't hear it, this program is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording after we're finished. So not immediately, but shortly. So again, welcome, and I hope everyone who has joined us today has had the opportunity during this past week to watch this absolutely wonderful film, Irena's Vow. We're so pleased that the writer of the film, Dan Gordon, is here to talk with us, and our own Gina Roitman will be asking him questions about the film and his experience writing it. Afterwards, there will be a brief Q&A, so please go ahead and enter any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll address as many of them as we can during the Q&A. First, a little bit about our guests. So Dan Gordon is, he was born in Los Angeles and raised both in LA and in the Valley of Jezreel in Israel. He served in the IDF from 73 to 2018, and then retired as an officer in the Givati Brigade in 2018. He is the screenwriter of over 20 feature films, including The Hurricane with Denzel Washington and Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner, and the movie we just viewed, Irena's Vow, for which he won the Writers Guild of Canada Best Screenplay Award. And he also wrote the Broadway play and the book based on this remarkable story. The book, I understand, is available on Amazon, so you can have the pleasure of reading that as well. Dan is also the author of 11 novels and 5 plays, which have been produced on and off Broadway and also in London's West End. And his most recent project is the 4-part documentary titled October 7th, 2023, which provides an in-depth look at the horrific events during and after October 7th, and it is currently streaming on TBN+. Our interviewer, Gina Roitman, whom I'm pleased to say many of you already know, was born in a displaced persons camp in Passau, Germany, and currently lives in Canada. She is an award-winning writer, biographer, and writing coach. Her works include the short story collection, Tell Me a Story, Tell Me the Truth, and the biography Midway to China and Beyond, as well as poetry, essays, and short stories. Her latest work is a literary thriller, the novel Don't Ask. In 2013, Gina was the subject and co-producer of the award-winning documentary film My Mother, the Nazi Midwife, and Me, which aired on CBC's Doc channel for 2 years. Gina is also a writing coach, and since 2018 has been working with Gen After's memoir writing workshops. We're delighted to have both Dan and Gina here today. We have planned some time for a brief Q&A after the interview, so everyone, again, please put your questions into the chat as they occur to you. With no further ado, I will turn the floor over to Gina and Dan. Welcome to you both. Gina, please.
Thank you, Shelley, for that lovely introduction. And I am truly thrilled for the opportunity to learn about Irena's story and its journey from war-torn Warsaw during the German occupation to the stage, the screen, and now the recently released novel. Dan, when did you come to learn about Irena Gut's story? How and when?
It was at least 30 years ago, and I was living at that time in Los Angeles, and I was driving home from a business meeting on a Sunday, and there used to be a radio program in LA called Religion on the Line that Dennis Prager used to host, and I was listening to it, and I heard Irena, who was the only guest. They used to have 3 clergymen who would be on there, but that night Irena was the only guest. And I heard her telling her story, and I was so captivated that when I pulled into my drive, I sat in the driveway for the next 2 hours listening to the show because I didn't want to leave. It was such an amazing story. The next day, I contacted the radio station and said, my name is Dan Gordon. I'm a screenwriter, blah, blah, blah. And could you pass my phone number along to Mrs. Updike and tell her that I'm interested in acquiring her life story rights to do a motion picture? And about 2 or 3 hours later, I got a phone call with this delightfully Polish accented voice on the other end saying, "Hello, Hania, this is Irene." And that began the absolute love affair that existed between myself and Irene. She was like a second mother to me, and I loved her dearly.
I think your affection for her is very clearly visible in how you drew her character. I was wondering, this started off as, you said 30 years, it started off as a screenplay. From there, it went to a stage play. Now it's a novel, but it became a screenplay. Took how long and why? Why would it take so long?
Well, oddly, the first development deal was relatively quickly. I had a deal with a company called Alliance Atlantis to do the motion picture of it. And anybody who's ever had a relative who's been in the motion picture business, I'm sure has heard the phrase development hell. And that's what development with a studio is. People are afraid to make decisions because if they greenlight a picture, which is a massive investment for any studio, and the picture fails, then they're to blame and they'll lose their job. So the way to avoid that unhappy consequence is to just keep the thing in development forever. And so they had me go through all the prescribed steps that were on my contract, which was a first draft, a second draft, and a set of changes. And then they decided, well, this still isn't working. And they hired a really crap writer who made a mess of things. And then they said, well, it just didn't work out and we've kind of abandoned the project. And the only time in my career that I've ever bought back a screenplay from a studio was with Irena's Vow. And I contacted the studio and I said, I'll pay you 100 cents on the dollar for every cent you paid me, but I don't want this project just sitting on a shelf somewhere. And just so you understand, usually you do maybe 10 or 15 development deals before one movie gets made. That's usually the ratio that I've found. So I've probably had during my career several hundred development deals because I've been in the business a long time. Like I said, this is the only one that I ever said I'm buying it back. I'm not going to let the thing just sit there on the shelf. And a lot of that, I must say, was thanks to Irene. Irene would poke me and say, Hanya, we can't let this just die, Hanya. And so I bought it back. The toughest kind of a movie to get made is a Holocaust movie. No one wants to make them. And so in the early 2000s, I thought, well, maybe I can get this off as a stage play. Maybe that'll be easier.
Mm-hmm.
Done a stage adaptation in New York of a motion picture of mine called Murder in the First. I liked the director very much. I liked the producers very much. And I approached them with the story and said, this is the best story you'll ever hear. And I pitched them over dinner one night in New York. And they said, wow, it's the best story we've ever heard. Let's see if we can't get this thing made. And I began workshopping the play at a small college in New England. And it was as Irene was dying. And she was in the hospital. She had never seen the play performed. She had read it. And I called, excuse me, I called her daughter, Gina, and said, hold the phone up for your mom to hear, as the audience was applauding the first performance. of the play. And I said, Irene, that applause is for you. And she passed away maybe 2 or 3 days later. So she knew that the play would get mounted. And the reason for it was she had always said to me, who will tell the children when I'm gone? That was her, towards the end of her life, that was the biggest concern she had. And I said, you will. I said, we're going to get this thing done as a play and eventually as a movie, and you will continue to tell your story. And so that really was the prime motive in getting this thing and not letting it go. You know, I've let go of an awful lot of projects that I loved dearly, just because.
This was a person,
Yeah, yeah, and I had made a promise.
like she did.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very true.
And so having written the screenplay, having had it produced, why the novel?
Novels are better than screenplays. Novels, you can do more in a novel than you can. You have a lot of constraints in a movie.
Mhm.
First of all, you have a time constraint. Second of all, you work with a director who has their own set of priorities, their own visions.
Mhm.
You have the exigencies of production, where sometimes weather turns bad and things have to be cut because you lost a location. In a book, you don't lose a location because of rain. You don't have to deal with a director. You deal with an editor, which is a different process. And I wanted to tell the story in that form. I was very, very happy with the play. I thought the play worked wonderfully. Um, I was less happy with the motion picture, to be candid, and I wanted a third crack at telling the story the way I thought it should be told.
So let's talk a little bit about Irena and her background. Um, as a Catholic woman, as a young Catholic woman who made a sacrifice, a big sacrifice with the major, what do you think led her to, what in her character brought her to do what she did? Was it where she came from? You know, did she have experience with Jews earlier in her life? What is it that you think formed her character and her integrity?
You know, Irena's maiden name was Irena Gut, and I've never heard a person more aptly named. She just was good, you know, she had a very innocent and deep faith that was, I think, much more spiritual than it was Catholic. She had a very personal relationship with God. And she had such a true moral compass. Her true north was so fixed. And if people saw the movie, the title comes from the fact that she witnessed a Gestapo officer kill a Jewish baby in a terribly brutal way and then shoot the mother. And she was hiding. In the movie, she's in a building. She was actually behind a fence. And she said there was nothing I could do. If I had made noise or stepped out or tried to prevent it in whatever way, she said I would have been killed too. So there was absolutely nothing I could do. She said, but at that point in time, I made a vow to God that if it ever came into my hands to save a life, I would do it. And that was a central vow in her life. Again, it wasn't in the movie. It should have been. When the war started, Irene was on the Eastern Front as a student nurse taking care of troops, and her position was overrun by the Russians. She was gang raped and beaten by 9 Russian soldiers and left for dead. And she was taken in by a Russian doctor, and They put her in a field hospital. She was abused again in the hospital. She went through hell before she ever got back to her hometown of Radom. And I think that she had a feeling that God had spared her for a purpose, that there was a reason she wasn't killed. Even though she went through horrific things, she could have easily been killed. Many people were, and she wasn't. And I think she thought, okay, what do I do with this life that God has given me? Because I should by rights be dead, so I must be here for some reason. And I think that reason became apparent to her after she saw the Jewish child murdered, and she made that vow. Also, she was raised in a town where the Jews were an integral part of the fabric of the life. Her father had a small factory, and his partner was a Jew, and the two families were best friends, and she celebrated holidays in her Jewish friend's home, and they celebrated holidays in her home. If I can, this is one of the reasons that I like novels more than books. You get to do things in books that you can't do in novels. I wanted to give people a sense of just what that community was in Radom. So it's a short section, and I hope you'll indulge me. Radom was a pleasant town in central Poland, neither big nor small, pleasant in the manner of such pleasant little Polish towns. Trees lined neatly laid out streets, with big houses, small houses, town squares, and cobbled streets. It began as a trade settlement, the old route between Rus, Lithuania, and Malopolska, Little Poland, and Silesia. In 1724, laws were enacted establishing de non tolerandis Judaeus, meaning Jews were not allowed to live or trade there except on the occasional days of fairs. But with the reforms of Alexander Wipolski in 1862 and the declaration of the national government in 1863, Jews were granted permission to live within the township and were ensured of equal status. They built a cemetery, a hospital, schools, libraries. A single-sex gymnasium for men was built in 1917. A year later, they built one for women. An 8-class coeducational gymnasium was established in 1928. By the eve of World War II, almost 40% of Radom was Jewish. There were 668 craft workshops, 90 larger industrial workshops, which employed 4,500 workers, Jews and non-Jews, laboring together. The town thrived in no small part because of the Jewish entrepreneurs working in milling and tobacco. There were brickyards run by Shmuel Adler and the Steinberg brothers, tanneries run by the Eismans and the Gutman brothers, furniture factories owned by Gottfried and Son, Gesch and Sons, Cohen and Sons, and the mills run by the Friedmans, the Gromans, and the Kirschenbaums. The Jews of Radom worked in textiles and tailoring. They were shoemakers and hairdressers. They were professionals as well, lawyers and teachers, doctors, dentists, and notaries. They published 18 newspapers, 5 in Polish, 13 in Yiddish or in Hebrew. There was a local legend of King Kazimierz, a peaceful man who built a palace for his true love, Esther, a beautiful Jewish girl, just like the Esther of the Bible. The Estherke house was still there in Radom at Rheineck number 5, just like in the legend. It was a pleasant town for Jew and Gentile alike.
Oh.
All of that vanished. All of that, when you think of that, how interwoven the Jews of that town were with the fabric of its life, all of that ceased to exist with the Holocaust. It's like you rip the soul out of a place. And one of the things that struck me, just as a person who makes a living writing, this was not a large city like Warsaw. This was a mid-sized town. They published 18 newspapers in that town, 13 of which were either in Yiddish or in Hebrew, and 5 of which were in Polish. So they were the heart and soul of that place. And I think that informed Irena in no small part. I mean, she had grown up not only not seeing Jews as the others, but seeing Jews as an integral part of her own life.
So it wasn't about religion. It was about, it was interesting. You said that you think she had a personal relationship with God,
Yes.
which is a very Jewish attitude, I think.
Yes. Yeah. And, I'll tell you two things. One, again, it's not in the movie, which is again why I like books better. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the movie, Irena wound up having to become the mistress of the German major in order to save the Jews whom she had hidden in his basement. After she did that, because she was religious, she went to a priest to confess and seek absolution. I mean, this aided her. Literally, she was being raped every night by the major. But she had made a decision willingly to do that in order to save the Jews, and she wanted absolution. So she went to the priest, and the priest said, I can't absolve you. He said, this is a mortal sin. You have to stop what you're doing. She said, but the Jews will be killed. He said, well, you have to be concerned about your soul. And she said, thank you very much. And she walked out, and that was the last time she was in a Catholic church. And her relationship with God, on the other hand, was typified in a scene that was truncated in the movie when one of the Jewish women, Ida Haller, found out that she was pregnant. The Jews said to Irene, because she was a student nurse, go to the pharmacy, get such and such implements to perform the abortion. And she said, no, I can't do that. And the way she saw it, it really wasn't a matter of religion. The actual quote, which she told me she said, which I believe she did say, was she said, Hitler is not going to get another Jewish baby. That was the way Irene looked at it. It wasn't a question of this is against my religion or anything. Hitler was not going to get another Jewish baby. And so they said, Irene, honestly, this is silly, we can't have a baby down here. The major will hear and will be discovered and we'll all be killed. And she said, God will not allow any harm to come to us because of this baby. And so one of the Jews said, you talked to God? And she said, yes. And he said, how? On a telephone? Because if you did, we would like to get an extension in the basement. I have a few things I'd like to say to God myself. Mm-hmm. And her attitude was, no, God will not allow any harm to come to us because of this baby. And you're right, it is so much more Jewish than Catholic. I remember a woman who I used to regard as my grandmother. She wasn't, but she was, I never knew my biological grandparents, but she was sort of a substitute one. I remember when I was a kid, she said, every baby brings its own luck with it into the world. And Irene had this pure faith. And she always, because I said, how would you even go about doing what you did? And she used a very Christian phrase, and not Catholic, but a very Christian phrase, which was basically she gave it up to God. She said, no one could plan to do what we did. No one could make a plan and say, well, in this circumstance, we'll do that, and the other circumstance, we'll do that. Each time they went from the frying pan into the fire so many times. And she truly believed God was there helping her all the way. And all she had to do was put her faith in God, and things would somehow turn out all right. Now, she added to that with her own wit and intelligence and improvisational skills, which she certainly—
And determination.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you have to realize she was a baby. When this whole thing started, she was 20 years old.
in years.
Yeah.
She was conceived.
Yeah.
So we have a bit of an understanding now as to what formed Irena, but what compelled you to sit in the driveway for 2 hours and listen to her story?
Good question. I think it was the notion of that perfect faith of someone who had a deeply personal relationship with God. It had much more to do with her and God than it had to do with her and the Jews. It wasn't that, oh, these are my best friends and I've got to save them, because they were all in all people in a laundry who she supervised. She became close to one girl, Fanka Silberman, who was the same age as she was. And so they had a nice bond. But these people weren't her best friends. It wasn't like, oh, I can't let this person who's like a sister to me die. That wasn't it. It was, and it wasn't, I can't do this because otherwise God will punish me. It wasn't a kind of, I'm afraid of God's wrath if I don't do this. It was, I made a vow to God and I can't not do this. And that kind of pure faith is extraordinary. And I had the story that has been sort of the story of my life that I've been most consumed with is the story of King David. And that was, excuse me, that was King David's relationship with God. It was a deeply, deeply personal relationship. It wasn't to some far off entity in the skies. It was, the Lord is my shepherd. Adonai Roi. God is my shepherd. That's how close the relationship is. And Irene had that same relationship with God. That's, I think, more than anything, what drew me to the story. And then, you just think as a screenwriter, you say, wait a second, she's hiding 12 Jews in the basement of a German major. That's a movie. Come on. You don't have to tell me anymore.
What is your personal experience with the Holocaust? Do you have a personal experience?
As I say, I never knew my grandparents on either side of my family. Both my father's parents and my mother's parents came from what was then Russia. I know about those members of the family who got to the United States, who came to the United States.
Before the war.
Yeah, my mother's family came in 1905, and my dad left Russia in 1921 and went to Canada and was a ranch hand in Canada for 20 some odd years until after World War II. And then he got sick of Calgary winters and came down to LA to look for a wife. Both of their families, extended families, uncles, cousins, whom I never met, we assume perished in the Holocaust because there was no more contact with them after World War II. So they perished in the Holocaust. Then when I went to Israel as a kid, I went by myself. I sort of ran away from home with my parents' encouragement. I had an adoptive family on the kibbutz where I was, on kibbutz Ginigaro. And they became as much my parents as my biological parents, Hanan and Miriam Greenwald of blessed memory. And Hanan was from Prague. And he was literally on the last train out of Prague after the Nazis had taken over. He was a 16-year-old boy. And the Germans had given permission for those young people who had already made plans to go to Palestine and had documentation that they were going to Palestine. They actually allowed them to leave. So he was on that last train. He begged his parents to come with him. And they said, no, we've been through worse. It'll pass. It's not so terrible. We know how to survive. And he said, then at least let me take my sister with me. And they said, are you crazy? It's so hot in Palestine. The climate is much too harsh for her. And so his parents, Hanan then enlisted in the British Army at 17 in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army and fought through Europe and was part of the brigade that was smuggling refugees out. And there were actually, the Jewish agency came and tasked the brigade with finding out how many Jews were left alive in Europe. The Jewish agency had no idea. They had no idea of the immensity of the Holocaust. And so they came to the brigade because the brigade at that time were the only people, they were a military. You had to have paperwork to pass between the various zones, between the Russian zone, the French zone, the American zone. And so the brigade chose one officer and 4 enlisted men. The officer was a 26-year-old captain named Hoteri Shai, and 4 enlisted men, one of whom was my adoptive father because he was a driver mechanic. So if the Jeep broke down, he could fix it. But also because between the 5 of them, they spoke every language of Eastern and Western Europe. And they used the cover of saying, we have soldiers who went AWOL to try and find their families, so we're trying to find the soldiers. That was the cover story. And they were the first ones to go into a lot of the camps. And I mean, incredible stories. I'll just diverge to tell you one story because diverging is part of the joys of being a storyteller. They went to one camp that was run by the Americans, and the colonel who ran the camp was from Mississippi or Alabama. Had probably never met a Jew in his life. Was clearly out of his depth. So Hoteri Shai came in and he said, I want to know how many Jews you have in your camp. And he said, we don't have any Jews in our camp. He said, I find that very hard to believe. Now you have to understand the difference between a captain and a colonel, that's a long distance. So this captain was being pretty insolent with this colonel. And he said, well, I don't care what you can or can't understand. You can look at my board. We have Poles, we got Romanians, we got Czechoslovakians, we got Estonians, but we ain't got no Jews. And he said, okay, I see your board. I guess you're right. You know, what am I going to do? Argue with you? Well, on the Jeeps of the Jewish Brigade, there was the symbol of the brigade, which was a yellow star, which they chose a yellow star to be in identification with their families, with the Jews of Europe, against the backdrop of the blue and white Israeli flag. That was the symbol of the Jewish Brigade. So the Jeeps were painted with that emblem. And they also had a shoulder flash, which had the same emblem. When Hoteri Shai came out, there were close to 1,000 people who were fighting to get close enough to the Jeep to kiss the fender. So he said in Yiddish, we are Jewish soldiers. We need to know how many people are left alive. So we're going to set up tables. We speak every language. We need you to come here and tell us where you come from, how many Jews are left alive, where are they, and one Jew who was very angry and offended by the question said, don't have to waste time setting up your tables. There are no Jews left alive. No families, no rabbis, no teachers, nothing. What you see is what's left. And Hoteri Shai said, you say you have no aunts, no uncles, no parents, no families. We are Jewish soldiers from the land of Israel. And we will be your parents, your uncles, and your aunts, and your families, and we will take you home. And they did. So having been raised on those stories told to me by my adoptive father, my connection to the Holocaust was, how can I put it, personal by choice.
His soul touched your soul.
Yeah.
And
And,
you are a wonderful storyteller.
you know, the Ginigar, like most kibbutzim that were around at that time, Ginigar was the third oldest kibbutz in Israel, so it was a very established kibbutz. There were waves of immigrants that the kibbutzim absorbed. So there was certainly the wave of the Czechoslovakian children, which my foster father was a part of. And then there were the wave of German immigrants. And then there were the wave of survivors who came in. And so we had numbers of survivors on Ginigar. And again, just one of those stories, there was one woman who I remember very well, very sweet woman, Heike was her name. And she and her husband had been separated at Auschwitz, and they both assumed that the other was dead. And they both came to Israel separately, believing that their children were dead, but they believed the spouse was dead as well. They ran into each other on a street in Haifa. And neither had taken another partner or spouse, and they had a remarriage, and they lived on Ginigar for the rest of their days. I knew them very well, so I knew that story. So when you're raised in the soup of not only your own immediate family, but an entire community.
Mhm.
And you know, when I lived in Israel, it's right around the time that the floodgates open. I went there in 1963. It was after the Eichmann trial. And prior to the Eichmann trial, survivors just didn't talk in Israel at all. They did not talk. After the Eichmann trial, they did. And I think a lot of them were eager. It was like, if I want to get it out of me finally. And if you were willing to listen, which I was, because I was a storyteller then, I knew I was going to be a writer. You had people who appreciated an audience, and you got a lot of stories.
So you've worn a lot of hats as a storyteller. You've been I made a list. It's forever. It goes forever. You're a screenwriter, a TV writer, a TV producer, a TV director, a film producer, a novelist, a playwright, and yes, a former sniper. So if you had to choose one description of yourself, what would it be?
Storyteller.
It's the most powerful thing to be. It's what holds us together as a people.
Yeah, it's the oldest profession. People say there's another one, but storytelling.
Yeah, but somebody had to tell the story about that oldest profession. So I'm totally overwhelmed by your stories. There's one more quote that came from the press kit that I wanted to read. You said that the story is much more relevant today than it was 10 years ago when you wrote it. That evil, which I think is a real living presence. I think it's like a cancer. I don't think it's ever gone. I think it's dormant. So the relevance is more so today than it was when I wrote it, by a factor of 1,000.
Absolutely.
Is this why you felt the need to write the novel, Irena's Vow?
I had written the novel before October 7th, which not only was the biggest pogrom of loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, but also unmasked as well as unleashed the current wave of Jew hatred. So I actually made that decision beforehand to write the novel. But again, I didn't realize the relevance of it until after October 7th.
I'm not sure that I can continue to ask the questions. When you were in the IDF, you identify as Israeli American, so you hold dual passports, I gather.
Right.
So when you were in the IDF, was it as an Israeli, and the role that you played, because you've worn so many different hats, and you tell stories, but as a sniper, you would be part of a story. How did that change you? I guess is what I'd like to know.
The biggest honor of my life was being a soldier in the Israel Defense Forces. The biggest, I think, gift of my life probably was being a soldier in the Israel Defense Forces. And I had a varied career, which was, you know, I got to do a lot of things. I was, in a very real sense, reborn in the IDF. I went into the IDF in time for the Yom Kippur War, and I served in that war, certainly not in any heroic capacity. But I did know a day towards the end of that war where I was absolutely 100% certain that I would not live beyond about 6:30, 7 o'clock that morning. That the unit that I was in would all be wiped out. And we were told we would be wiped out. We were told, our regimental sergeant major said, your job is to take as long dying as possible, because we had to hold a particular position until it could be reinforced. And that was okay. I mean, I finally wrote about that in a different screenplay last year, about a unit that's in a position where they know they're going to be wiped out that morning. There is an incredible calm that descends on you at that point. You know that there are no problems after that. There are no decisions after that. Your whole life boils down to, I was in a laughingly called a tank hunter unit. And our job was to hit, we were a 3-man unit, was to hit tanks with Lao rockets and hit, move, hit, move, hit, move until we were taken out. And we had gotten in this huge shipment of these things the night before, these American Lao rockets, which none of us had ever seen before. None of us had ever fired one. We got a brief demonstration. And they formed us up into, you know, these tank hunter units. And I was a decent shot, so that was my job. And I said to the sergeant major, I want a bunch more of those, you know, if we're going to be in a major battle. He said, no, it's a waste of rockets. You won't live long enough to shoot more than 5 or 6. So don't worry about it. That attack never came. The ceasefire went into effect, and the attack never came. And the reason the ceasefire came into effect was because Anwar Sadat, of very blessed memory, at 4 o'clock that morning, in a conversation with Henry Kissinger, Kissinger said, Golda has gone as far as she can go, and if you accept a ceasefire now, I can preserve your military gains and translate those into political gains. But if the war goes on longer than today, Israel will be completely victorious, your military gains will be wiped out, and there won't be a leverage to do a peace treaty. So you need to decide And Kissinger in his memoirs later said that Sadat did the one thing he never expected him to do, which no other leader would have done. Any other leader would have said, well, let me discuss it with my chief of staff and my vice president, my this and whoever. And instead, Sadat said, tell the old lady she has a deal. And that's why I'm alive. So had he not said that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that was a seminal moment of my life. And I was 26 years old. And it was like, okay, I understand when my Christian friends talk about being born again. I understand maybe better than they do what the phrase means. And then the IDF itself, you are thrown into this melting pot of people from all over the world where nobody really cares about anything that you did outside of the army. Everything depends on what you do with the person next to you. It is one of the most extraordinarily moral organizations I've ever been in. I never, ever was asked or ordered to do anything that I'm ashamed of. And I was served for 45 years and did an awful lot of things of which I'm inordinately proud. So that, yeah, that's a long answer to a simple question, but I became whoever it is that I am in Israel. That's where I became me. It started when I was 16, and it came to fruition after I was a soldier. And for better or worse, whoever I am, that's where I became me.
Well, we're certainly grateful you became you. The stories you tell are gripping, and I'm looking forward to reading the novel. It's available on Amazon.
Yeah, and I encourage people to read it because, again, the movie, which I think is a good movie, not a great movie, but I think it's a good one. I think it would, for full disclosure, I think it would have been better if I had directed it, but that's okay. And I obviously every writer feels that. But in the book, you get to, if anybody wants to see exactly what the vision was that I had and that I believe was truer to who Irene was, it's in that book. And also, I certainly recommend. Irene wrote a book with a ghostwriter, and again, her voice didn't come through as well as it should have, but you certainly get more of Irene's character, which is wonderful in her book, In My Hands. I had to compress her story a lot, and In My Hands gives you a much broader picture. And I fictionalized a number of things just for the purposes of a motion picture. But In My Hands gives you, the full picture that Irene gave to the ghostwriter.
So I have one last question, and that is, I'm curious as to, having done a play and a screenplay, and why did you choose to write a novel rather than a biography?
Also a good question. Irene had done her autobiography, and it's called In My Hands. I wanted to do certain things that I don't believe you can do, or at least you shouldn't do in a biography, which is to give interior monologues, what the person is thinking at a given point in time. You can't really do that, or you can, but you should not in a biography. Nothing gives you that right. Where you can in a novel. Also, biographies sometimes aren't as powerful as a novel which is inspired by a biography, because there are a lot of rough edges, and when you're doing a novel, you can, for dramatic purposes, streamline things and make them have more impact. So that, yeah, and I've never done a biography, and yet I've done 11 novels. Even I did a book called Wyatt Earp, which was about Wyatt Earp, but I certainly wouldn't consider it's a novel, not a biography. Because I wanted to be able to take license and say what Wyatt was thinking and what arguments he had with his wife and what have you. Who, by the way, was Jewish. Josephine Sarah Marcus, Wyatt Earp, was married to a nice Jewish girl from San Francisco.
Really?
And is buried in a Jewish cemetery.
My goodness.
Yeah, go figure, huh?
Go figure. We're everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, he's buried in the Hills of Eternity cemetery in Colma, California.
Really? And you were born where in California?
A little town called Bell Gardens, which is in Southeast LA, which was made up of primarily Okies and Arkies and Texans who came out during the Grapes of Wrath era. We were the only Jews in town.
Really? And now you live in Birmingham, Alabama? I'm sure you're not the only Jews in town.
No, there's a nice Jewish community here in Birmingham, which is an absolutely spectacular town.
So you said.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass the baton back to Shelley. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that people have left to be answered. And I thank you so much for your openness and your storytelling. It's fabulous.
Thank you, Gina. It was one of the most pleasurable and best interviews I've ever done, and I appreciate you tremendously. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate you both. That was phenomenal. I'm overwhelmed. I'm moved. It was so exciting to learn more about Irena and about you, Dan. That was wonderful. And Gina, thank you, Gina, thank you so much for those insightful questions. This was just fantastic. I again can't thank you both enough. So now we are going to turn to answering some questions from our audience, and Rachel Miller, who's a member of our program committee, is going to field those questions and help with that. Rachel.
Okay. Well, our first question came from Pauline Steinhorn, and she was talking about In My Hands, the young adult novel that Irena published. And she then later said, thank you so much for answering all her questions about that. So we've a very thorough interview, and a lot of the questions we had and prepared even. You've just done an extraordinary job. But Anat asks us, she says, I wonder what other long-lasting impact living on a kibbutz and Israel had on you. Now, you just told us your war story, your seminal story. She says her family, Simcha and Shoshana Zeldman, were among the founders of Ginagar.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, she tells the truth. That's Anat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow, go figure. Jewish geography. That's great.
So do you think the kibbutz had a big impact on you?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest impact of my life. The absolute biggest. It's where I became whoever I am. I'll tell you just one story about that. Hanan and Miriam were obviously tremendous influences in my life and became, like I say, as much like my parents as my biological parents. And because my biological parents died when my children were still relatively small, the only grandparents they really remember are Hanan and Miriam, my foster parents or adoptive parents. I was blessed in a lot of ways. When I got to Israel, I didn't speak Hebrew. I got there, I can tell you when I got there, July 5th, 1963. And by the time school started, I could sort of get along conversationally because I have a good ear for languages, but I certainly couldn't write compositions in Hebrew. And I had a literature teacher named Shlomo Carniel, the greatest teacher of my life. And he allowed me to write my compositions in English. And just to put Shlomo into perspective, Shlomo was from Warsaw, and he was 8 years old when he and his brother were sent to Auschwitz. And of course, there's no question that he was not going to survive. He was an 8-year-old child. He wasn't useful for work. So by rights, he should have gone to the gas chambers. And Mengele was sick that day. And there was a medical orderly who had taken his place. And they had a line of people, and they said, you have to sign here to get your belongings back after your showers. And he could speak very little German, not a lot. I mean, he was a child prodigy, but he couldn't speak German fluently. He could speak some words. And he thought, how do I communicate with this man and get him to let me to live? And he saw that the guy had a wedding ring. So he told me that when he stepped up to sign the receipt thing, he blocked out Auschwitz, and he poured all the love that he had into making his signature as beautiful as it possibly could be, as if he was showing off for his parents, who by now he knew were dead. And he signed, and then he turned it around for the guy to see. And the guy said to him in German, "You like learning, studying?" He said, "Yes, and I want to continue to learn." So the guy looked around and said, "Go over there." And that's how he was saved. And his brother was 15, he was 18. The brother was 15 and a big kid. They escaped from Auschwitz and were able to hook up with a partisan unit, and later he came to Israel. He was an alcoholic. He never came into class that he wasn't hungover and smoking. You know, we're in high school, and he would sit there like this with his head in his hand, smoking the cigarette. You'd see the cigarette here. And kibbutz kids are animals. We were just the worst, rowdiest, most horrible children in the world. We drove some poor, wonderful teacher out of our classroom by throwing fruit at him and stuff because he wouldn't answer a question. I mean, we were just wild animals. Everyone was absolutely quiet while Shlomo tried to gather his thoughts, and then he would take his hand down, and in a whisper, he'd start to speak. And he taught world literature. And so anyway, I wrote a composition for him about whatever book we were studying. And he said, I want to come out to your kibbutz. He lived on Ifat, which is down the road from Gina. He said, I want to come out to your kibbutz and talk with you. Now that was a big deal in 1963 because the buses didn't run on Shabbat. And he had to sign out on a car, which was a very big deal in 1963. It cost you a lot of money. So I thought, I'm in deep shit because obviously I'm about to be kicked out of school. I'm going to be expelled. And that was a big deal for me because I was alone in Israel and I was sort of hanging on by a thread anyway. And if I was kicked out of school, what do I do? And so I was really sweating it. He came out to the kibbutz, and Gina has a beautiful forest, the Balfour Forest, that sort of surrounds the kibbutz and goes up the mountains of Nazareth. And he said, let's take a walk up into the woods. And he's not speaking to me. And God, I'm dying. Finally, we get up into the woods. He lights up another cigarette. I have no idea how he even managed to get up the trail. He smoked so much. And he said, I have what I think is very bad news for you. And I thought, that's it, man. The hammer's about to drop. I'm out of here. He said, I think you're a writer. He said, and I I don't know what you want to do about that. And if I were you, I would run from it. But if you decide not to run from it, I can help you. And I had been waiting all my very short life, I was all in all 60 years old, to hear those words. Because that's what I wanted to do. That's who I thought I was. And he said, you don't come to class anymore. I don't want to see you in class. I'm going to give you a reading list. You go to the library. You're not ready to write. If you write right now, you're going to just build in bad habits. You're going to read, and then we're going to talk. And all we're going to do for the next year is talk about what you read. That's all we're going to do. And he was the greatest mentor of my life. I owe him not just my career, I owe him who I am at my core, I think. I loved this guy so much, I almost married his daughter to become his son-in-law. She was a nice girl, but I certainly wasn't in love with her. But the idea of being Shlomo's son-in-law was so attractive to me. And he was absolutely the greatest influence in my life. So if I say, what was Ginagar to me, Ginagar was where I became me.
Okay. Let me go back. Did your adopted parents or their community members write their stories?
They did somewhat, but not in an organized fashion. They for what they call the Alona Kibbutz, the kibbutz newsletter, a lot of them wrote their memories and things like that. Hanan wrote a bit, not a lot. He gave me. Hanan was much more of a photographer than he was a writer. He was a very, very good photographer from a very early age. So he gave me the book of photographs, which he did. All during the time that he was in the brigade, he was taking pictures. So those photographs are pretty harsh. I mean, they're inside the camps, sometimes right after they were liberated. And as part of that, he never said, and here it is, but it was there, and I saw it. It was the telegram, two telegrams. One, which he had sent via the Red Cross to his parents, hoping they were still alive, saying, I'm well, I'm alive, I'm in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army, here's my serial number. The Jewish Brigade can find me. And the other was the telegram that he got from the Red Cross informing him that his parents and his sister were killed in Auschwitz, that they were on the last transport from Theresienstadt. He knows what transport they were on. And more or less what date they were killed. And sort of that's, what else did he have to say?
Okay, the next question from Susan. Susan's going back to the movie. How long did Irena hide the Jews before moving them to the forest? And how long was she in the Russian prison before she was aided in her escape? And I would add that watching the movie, I was always thinking, like, how long? Where are they in time? That was a very difficult one for me as well. So, how long were they in the forest?
Well, she hid them in the Major's house for 8 months.
8 months. Uh-huh.
That was how long they were in the Major's house. After that, the time that they were with the partisans was relatively short because it was right near the end of the war.
Mhm.
The time that she was in the Russian prison camp was also relatively short. And she thought, as did they all, that they were going to be deported to Siberia. And people were being deported to Siberia. And the Jews who she rescued, that part is true, smuggled her out of the camp and got her false papers and gave her the identity of Sophie Soferstein, a German Jewish refugee, and they got her into Germany, into a German DP camp.
Okay.
And by the way, I'll just digress again. So she's in the German DP camp, and she believes her family is dead. She also can't go back to Poland because the Russians have now taken over, and she was in a Russian prison. So where is she going to go? She had no family. And she said, my only friends were Jews. So she started learning Hebrew, and she was going to go to Israel because she couldn't get a visa to go to the United States.
Mhm.
She got very sick. And I think she had tuberculosis. I don't remember, but something like that. And she missed her slot at leaving. And she had, the camps were run by the Haganah, and most of them guys who were in the Jewish Brigade. And they all knew her story. And so they said, you'll be the first one out of here because you saved our people. And then she got sick and she missed her slot. So one day, a guy from the UN High Commissioner on Refugees came to the camp. And the head of the camp said to him, look, before you go on your inspection tour, I want to tell you that we've been lying to you. There's a woman here who's not really a German Jewish refugee. It was all a lie. But if ever there was a person who deserves to go to the United States, it's her. She has no business going to Israel. There's going to be a war there. She's done everything she can do. She needs to be in a safe place. So he called Irene in to meet with the guy from the High Commissioner on Refugees. Now, Irene said between the two of them, they spoke 6 languages, but not one in common. So she spoke to him, told her story through the head of the camp who interpreted. This guy said, wow, you're right. If ever there was a person who deserved to come to the United States, you're it. I'll take care of it. A couple weeks or a month pass, she gets a visa, just like he said, and she's in the United States. Again, she knows nobody in the United States. And she's fluent in Yiddish. And her only friends are Jews, so she got a job in the garment district. And she spoke Yiddish all day long, and she was with the rest of the Jewish women in the garment district. Cut to whatever year they opened the new UN building. I think it was 53 or 54, something like that. Everybody wanted to go see the UN building because it's beautiful architecture, and now it's in New York, and it's a big deal. So she, like any tourist, went down to the UN building, and she went into the cafeteria, which I later went into because we actually performed the play of Irena's Vow. Irena's Vow is the only play that's ever been performed in the UN. And so that was a big special deal. So I went to the cafeteria because I knew this story. She's sitting in the cafeteria. It's crowded. There's no seats anywhere because it's one of the first days that it's open to the public. Everybody wants to see the building. Tall, distinguished-looking man stops at her table and says, excuse me, is this seat taken? Because there's no other seats anywhere in the cafeteria. Can I sit down? So she said, no, I said, there aren't any seats. It's true. He wasn't just coming on to her. So she said, bye, sit down. He said, I think I know you. And she said, I'm sure you don't. Unless you work in the garment district, you don't know me. And she thought, this guy's hitting on me and I don't need it. And he said, no. He said, I have a terrible memory for names, but I never forget a face. He was the diplomat from the UN High Commissioner on Refugees who got her visa into the United States. His name was Bill Opdyke. They were married. He was a widower, and they were married 3 months later, and they were married for the next 40 years. So,
Woo.
before he goes on,
Shit.
Okay. Yeah, every question seems to be making me cry.
Rachel, I'm going to cut in because I think I'm watching the clock. Do you have maybe one more question? And then I'd like to turn it over to
I would
Liz.
love to. I hear from Dina. No, I don't know who told me. The producer, Jeff Sackman, is on with us this morning. And I'm wondering if he could say a word about
but before he does,
Yeah.
because it's too modest to say it, Jeff Sackman and his partner, Barry, engaged in absolutely heroic efforts to get this movie made. No other producer that I know of, it took them 7 years to put the package together, the financing. Any other producer in their right mind would have walked away from this thing. Jeff and Barry's commitment to Irene's story was as firm as mine was, and they absolutely refused to take no for an answer, and they are both to be applauded because this movie would never ever have gotten made without them.
Well, let's thank them, truly. Thank you and thank them. If you're on, could you unmute yourself and just say hello to our group and add anything you'd like to add before we end this session? Jeff? See if we could find him. Well, I guess we've somehow gotten a direct message. Oh, well, I'm glad we got to talk about him anyway. And how did you find this producer that was so amazing?
I didn't. There were two other producers who had optioned the screenplay, if I remember this correctly. And they thought, because I have triple citizenship, I have Canadian citizenship as well, because through my dad. They thought, well, maybe we can partner with Canadian producers and get this done as Canadian content, and we'll stitch together, with a telefilm sale, we'll stitch together some more money. So they approached Jeff and Barry Meyerowitz, and Jeff and Barry fell in love with the story. And when the option was up with these two other producers, I don't remember if they contacted me or I contacted them. At any rate, they said, look, these two guys didn't know what they were doing. Let us take the thing, give us an option, and we will get this movie made. And it took 7 years to do, but they did it.
Okay. All right. I think I've run out of my time. I'm going to turn you back over, but it sounds like we owe a lot of dedicated people to have this wonderful movie, and I hope many people see it.
I echo those sentiments. Again, my thanks to everybody, but don't anybody leave. I'm going to turn the floor over to Susan and Abjan, another of our program committee members, who is going to take just a moment to talk about an organization that works to help righteous Gentiles. So, Susan.
Thank you, Shelley. And I'm going to start by just sharing a little bit about the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, or the JFR, who works with righteous Gentiles like Irena, who refuse to be passive in the face of the evil that they witnessed, and rescue Jews, often at risk to their own lives and to the lives of their families. As they've aged, many of those righteous Gentiles are in need. And in 1986, JFR was established to fulfill the traditional Jewish commitment to take Hakarat Hatov, the searching out and recognition of goodness. JFR is committed to supporting aged and needy rescuers in 18 countries. In addition to providing the needed financial assistance to rescuers each month, the foundation preserves the memory and legacy of the rescuers through its National Holocaust Education Program. They educate middle and high school teachers about the history of the Holocaust, and they provide them with the resources to integrate this knowledge into their classrooms. If you'd like more information on the organization's work, the information that was on the screen would provide that to you. I want to thank Dan and the producers of Irena's Vow. I'm sorry Jeff is not still on, and Barry as well, for bringing Irena, the righteous Gentile, who, by the way, was supported by JFR, as was her husband, the only non-Jew to be admitted into a Jewish nursing home, to the world's attention. May each of us, if confronted with immorality, rise up as did Irena and others who have been supported by JFR. And now, wow, I'm sure that everyone will agree with me that Irena was an amazing individual, and the story that was presented through Dan's writing was powerful. It's a story that needed to be told and needs to be told and shared to bring to light not just Irena's heroic actions, but the actions of others like hers whose stories remain untold. It was made more powerful by Dan, you sharing as well your own personal story and why you undertook this lengthy endeavor. Thank you to Gina for moderating the program and the interesting questions you and the audience posed to Dan. Dan, thank you so much for this amazing film and for taking the time from your very busy schedule to share your insights with us about Irena, the making of this documentary, and your own personal life. A special thank you to our program committee for planning and putting on this program, along with thanks to our IT specialist, Ephraim Katsir. To our audience, thank you for viewing the film and for posting important questions. Please share with your friends and family that this documentary is available for streaming, as well as the book of the same name. On that note, on behalf of Generations After, we hope that you enjoyed the program, and we would appreciate you completing the survey link that you will shortly receive in an email to help us evaluate this program and in planning future programs. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.